Welcome back, and I know that all of you have greatly enjoyed the plays of Aristophanes, and especially that last one, Frogs. And I know that it's going to be a little bit hard for you to have to get up from Aristophanes and move on to some other playwrights, but it is in fact time to do that. We need to move from Greek Old Comedy, which I know that we've all dearly loved, into Greek New Comedy. So thank you very much, of course, for spending this much time with me as we did get to survey the plays of Aristophanes, but hope that you'll continue with the same positive spirit as we now move on to our other three playwrights. So we're going to start off with the other Greek playwright, the new comedy playwright named Menander. The first thing I need you to do is to please pause your video and open Sakai. Please go to Resources and locate handout number 2. So you may recall that handout number 1 was the one about Aristophanes, and now I'd like you to open handout number 2, which is the one about Menander. So please pause your video and open handout number 2 under Resources. Okay, do you have that ready? Okay, so I'll review here the context of comedy in order to make sense where Menander falls, and also we need to review a little bit of Greek history to put that also in context for why there's so much difference between Aristophanes and Menander. Okay, so first of all, we talked extensively with Aristophanes about his own playwright style, as well as the genre that's referred to today as Old Comedy. You may want to, in fact, go back and review the video on Old Comedy as well as stage drama in order to get a sense of how comedy worked at that time, because that will help you with the next video after this one, which is New Comedy, explaining why there's so much difference between them. Okay, so politically, by the time you get to this period when Menander is writing in Athens, things have changed drastically with Athens. Now, you've been following along with the historical videos through the Peloponnesian War and down into the 4th century BC as Athens gets tangled up with Sparta and Thebes. And then, of course, you saw the incursion of the Macedonians from the north. So the point here is that Athens, of course, had a very strong democracy from 508 BC down all through the 400s BC and a good way into the 300s BC. However, even though Athens was strong in the sense of having quite a lot of control over a whole network of allies, first the Delian League and then later the Second Athenian Confederacy, as we'll talk about further in historical videos, Athens did not, as it turns out, have a great deal of foresight when it came to where her empire would fall in relation to other powers that might eventually come in from outside, and in particular did not have enough prudence to be on the lookout for Macedon. Even though in the 4th century BC, Athens had quite a bit of warning from the orator Demosthenes, who tried really, really hard in a whole series of so-called Philippic speeches to paint Philip out as the lethal enemy that would eventually get the Athenians. The Athenians should have actually paid attention, especially the year 348 BC, when she lost one of her important allies up north, the city Olynthus, to Philip, who came in and took it over. But even that was not enough to galvanize either the Athenians or the general Greeks quickly enough to withstand the threat of Philip. And by the time they finally did get wise to it and tried to oppose him in 338 BC at Chaeronea, he was just able to defeat the entire Greek army and eventually, in time, take over all of Greece. And even though he died shortly thereafter in an assassination, his son Alexander was able to solidify that hold on Greece from Macedon before heading off east to start in with his imperial expansion. Okay, so where does this all fall in with Menander? By the time Menander is writing, the Athenians no longer have real control over their democracy the way that they had under Aristophanes. And effectively now the Athenians had a regency subordinate to Macedon that was run by this man, Demetrius of Phaleron. So with that type of regency, the Athenians didn't have the freedom to put out the political satire of the Aristophanic type, as we saw with Aristophanes in Old Comedy. So when Menander is writing, Old Comedy was pretty much gone. In fact, in terms of style, Old comedy doesn't appear to have survived much beyond the Peloponnesian War of the 5th century BC, as we talked about back at that time, that when you even already can see with the later plays of Aristophanes that there's already a weakening of the old comedy set up, with the full elaborate choruses and so forth. You don't see anywhere near as much of that with the last two plays of Aristophanes, which are almost effectively more like middle comedy plays in the 4th century BC. So old comedy might have been on its way out anyway. But the real distinct change with the Athenian government, with no longer having the free and open democracy, did mean that plays were not going to be able to engage the Athenian government in this political adversarial type of relationship that had been so much fun to watch with Aristophanes and Cleon. It just wasn't going to happen that way anymore. So Menander's plays end up being much more neutral and socially general and generic in their content, and not at all related specifically to the Athenian government, as had been the case under Old Comedy. So we'll discuss more of that in our next video, which is about New Comedy. But for right now, let's now turn to our handout to introduce the new playwright of Menander. We don't have his exact dates of birth and death, but we say something like 344 BC for his date of birth, and approximately 292 BC for his date of death. We don't unfortunately know much about him either. As you may remember, we didn't know much about Aristophanes either. He was a fairly successful playwright, although by no means an extraordinarily outstanding one of his day. He scored 8 victories out of about 100 plays that he wrote. However, later reputation for him improved quite a bit, and he was considered one of the outstanding, most accomplished new comedy playwrights that the Athenians were able to have. And his connection with Demetrius of Phaleron was really quite fortunate, because that was how he was able to get a lot of sponsorships. So that this relationship here mattered a lot in terms of getting Menander public recognition. And quite a bit of the philosophy that infiltrates the plays comes from the philosopher Theophrastus, whom he studied under. Okay, so that's the bio on the first page. You can scroll down now to further down page 1, and we'll talk about his theatrical career. So as we said, he wrote over 100 plays, and his first production that we know of is 324 BC. Unfortunately, Menander's plays do not fare as well as those of Aristophanes. Despite having a very large number of plays, only one play, the one that you are reading for this course, the Grouch, Discalus, survives intact. So there are other ones that have large fragments from which we're able to reconstruct what's basically going on in the plays. But Discalus, the Grouch, is the only one that survives almost entirely intact, and even it does have, as you'll see in the text, even it does have a few lacunae here and there in them. But obviously we'll take what we can get. Okay, so Discalus, the Grouch, is the only one that actually survives intact out of all the plays that survive. And as you can see, there are several others that do have the large fragments surviving. Discalus itself was produced in 316 BC at the Lanaya Festival, and it took first place. Okay, now when you go into the second page of the handout, you can see some of the other fragments. And then if we go down to G, we'll talk a little bit about what the nature of Menander's plots are, which also ties in with the new comedy video that we're going to get next. So frequently the plots are repetitious. You have the same kinds of themes that come up repeatedly, almost like a sitcom, essentially. And the characters are nobody in particular. They're not anybody that you would recognize historically or politically in any noteworthy way. They're just basically ordinary people, and they're very easily substitutable, as are the plots. So they're all stock. And again, we'll talk with new comedy about the whole concept of the stock characters. So frequently you'll have a boy and a girl, a young man and a young woman, who are in love with each other but can't get to each other because the woman is in some way inaccessible because of a social problem, or as in the case of Discalus, because her father won't let her go, or we'll see a lot in Roman comedy because she's been purchased by a major and has a contract and can't get out of the contract, and so forth. So often you have a very silly, stupid young man, an absolutely beautiful but often brainless woman in love with him, and then often a clever slave who is much more intelligent and wise than his master and is able to finagle things in order to get whatever we want to have happen to actually occur. And it's usually the marriage, or at least the connection between the young men and the young woman that's supposed to happen, and the overcoming of whatever obstacles there are getting in the way of that. And you can get other extra characters too, like, such as an older man who believes the mistress is unfaithful. Often you'll have a father-in-law or a mother-in-law that fits into this. You may oftentimes have a baby that's born inconveniently at the wrong time, and you're not sure who the father is. And it matters a lot, of course, in the ancient Greek world because of inheritance matters. You must remember from World of Athens that a woman was not allowed to own property in her own right. Instead, if she became a widow, she was expected to remarry as quickly as possible. That was that term epikleros. She was an heiress, but she didn't really have actual control of the property. So therefore, a woman who's by herself, who's single or a widow, is in fact in a vulnerable spot because she can't actually own the property that is trusted to her. So she has to get married as quickly as possible. So for Cnemon, this grouchy old man, to be holding her back and not allowing her to eventually connect with the young man Sostratus, is, in addition to being very inconsiderate to this girl, is also contrary to custom, and really even in a way a flouting of the law, because we need to get this woman's future settled so that the estate that Cnemon will eventually will to her will get into a proper male heir's hands. So there's in fact a recognizable difficulty here with the way Cnemon is behaving. It's not just simply that he's being mean and nasty. There's also the difficulty that socially he is out of step with Greek culture, because he is not in fact allowing his daughter to get married, as in fact as a proper father he should be doing. So all of these domestic kinds of issues are what are going to prevail with New Comedy, and in particular with this particular comedy of Menander. So Menander scores well in the reputation of the ancient Greek world, again, as being one of the most successful of the New Comedy playwrights. Several of his comedies we do know of became the models for the later Roman playwrights, who frequently did model most of their plays after the Greek models, and Menander's plays were in fact among the most popular for that. And the general feeling is that obviously there's only so much you can do when you really have only a limited number of elements of plots and characters to work with. But Menander really is actually quite versatile and quite ingenious with the plot. You'll see, of course, the high points in Discalus. The fact that Discalus, the grouch Cnemon, is in fact acting as a grouch, and he is thwarting efforts to get to his daughter in completely socially unacceptable ways. But he almost undergoes a kind of epiphany by falling down the well and then re-emerging, being saved by his son and the slave, and then all of a sudden recognizing for a moment there, maybe, I really haven't been behaving very well. I haven't seen what life is really all about, and that's of course when he does commit his daughter over to his son for him to arrange a marriage. And as it turns out, Sostratus, of course, is right there waiting in the wings to receive her. So it works out quite well. But you notice that although he looks almost like he's going to convert, he is an old dog after all, and he cannot really be taught new tricks. And so finally, it's the slaves who overcome the limitations on that master, who drag him out and get him over to the party, where he finally has to acknowledge that he is part of a larger world, and he does have to celebrate with them the marriage of his daughter. So again, all of this is your typical, fairly mundane type of plot that's going to prevail much more now with New Comedy and eventually with Roman comedy. But as such, Menander was considered one of the most successful in his day at carrying out those plays and making them quite interesting and vivid. Okay, so that's our playwright Menander. So we're going to spend some more time in the next video on New Comedy, and please obviously give the grouch Discalus your attention, because there are discussion questions that are going to ask you to compare Menander's plays with Terence's plays, and also later on with Plautus's plays. So make sure you understand how New Comedy works in the Greek sense with Discalus so that you will be able to make those comparisons. And as always, remember, again, do your forum assignment and also do your student critique for attendance. Okay, thanks so much for sitting through this video, and we'll see you next video for new commenting.